Okay, we'll give it just a couple of seconds just to get some people situated. For those who are joining early, thank you for sitting through the Zoom difficulties. I don't think they're going to be getting very happy emails from this session or from this webinar, but that's Zoom's problem. So we're just going to give it a little bit of time. Then I just have a little bit, and then we're going to go for our main event here with Josh Zucker. So. Okay, I will be helping out with the tech support and the moderation of this chat. This session is being recorded, so I do not work for Zoom. However, if there are any issues, people are having trouble listening or anything like that, please let me know. I'll do the best I can to get us through that. When this session starts, Josh is going to speak for about 20 minutes through a presentation, and then after we're going to open it up for questions. If you do have questions before the presentation is over, feel free just to put them in the chat, and I will answer them roughly in the same order that they're given in. If you would like to be your voice to be heard, just raise your hand, and I can actually promote you so you can ask your question that way. With that said, this is a family friendly show, so keep your questions at least somewhat PG. We're all adults here, so and then the big thing is just don't be a jerk. If you're a jerk, I might have to kick you out. So please, everyone, be civil to each other. Not that we expect any of those issues. So
Yeah,
with that,
Ethan.
that is right. With that, I would like to introduce our speaker. He is the host of the Grand Dukes of the West, which is the story of the Valois Burgundy of one of the most exciting in the late Middle Ages. The four Valois Dukes of Burgundy used political intrigue, calculated splendor, economic power, and good old-fashioned violence to forge out a state of the many duchies and counties between France and the Holy Roman Empire. During Burgundy's height, its dukes were seen as many of the equals of kings and emperors, and their court was the center of Western Europe's cultural and political development. And then it fell apart. So, with that said, I will introduce you to Josh Zucker. Josh, it is all yours.
All right. Hello, hello. Let me get my slides up real quick. If share. Beautiful. Can you see that? How about now? All right. So, my name is Josh Zucker. I'm the host of Grand Dukes of the West, and as you just heard, it follows the story of the rise and fall of Burgundy. And today I'm going to be talking about character assassination in the Middle Ages, and specifically the case of Duke Louis of Orleans and Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. Now, if you've read a history of France from the 19th century or earlier, or even a pop history from today, you might be familiar with the following story. Around the turn of the 15th century, the King of France, Charles VI, was struck by a debilitating mental illness. And for the rest of his life, the king would alternate between sanity and madness. When he was absent, as his episodes of insanity would become known as, he did not recognize his family and friends. He did not know that he was the King of France. Sometimes he thought that he was just a knight named George. Sometimes he thought he was made out of glass and that he could shatter at any moment. Sometimes he would get agitated and he would claim that he was being pursued by his enemies. When the king was sane, he was tired, confused, and easily manipulated, and he would often simply agree with whatever the last person to talk to him said. Now, we are still a ways away from French absolutism, but simply put, the King of France being unable to make decisions on his own accord is a bad thing. The intrigue and factional politics that are always a part of the court were unleashed without the steady hand of a strong king to keep them in check. Over the course of Charles's reign, a handful of factions would rise and fall, but today we really only need to focus on two of them, the Burgundians and the Orleanists. Philip the Bold, the Duke of Burgundy, was an uncle of the king and the leading statesman of France. He had dominated the regency during Charles VI's minority, and now that the king is indisposed again, he fully intends on returning to his earlier position of prominence. Louis, the Duke of Orleans, was the ambitious younger brother of the king, and he was 20 years old when his brother first showed signs of his mental illness. As the brother of the king, he was the natural leader of France, and he is determined to act as such. Philip and Louis found themselves locked in a battle for dominance until 1404, when Philip died, and the Duke of Orleans gained ascendancy. For the next few years, Louis drove the kingdom into bankruptcy as he lived a lavish life at the king's expense. Taxes were raised and immediately diverted into Louis's pockets. French progress against the English stalled as their army sat unpaid. Royal justice decayed as the law courts grew corrupt and filled with Orleanist toadies, and Louis began a sordid affair with the Queen. But is that what really happened? Let's look at a few histories. Francois Guizot's History of France, published in 1848, states that, quote, "The Duke of Orleans was elegant, affable, volatile, good-natured. He had for his partisans at court those who shared his worse than frivolous tastes and habits, and his political judgment was no better than his habits. No sooner was he invested with power than he abused it, strangely. And there had grown up between Queen Isabeau of Bavaria and Louis, Duke of Orleans, the brother of the king, an intimacy which, throughout the city and amongst all honorable people, shocked even the least straight-laced." Moving forward a little bit, Pierre Goubert's History of France, published in 1984, states that, "Seductive, ostentatious, and depraved, he was overly fond of his sister-in-law, the frivolous Queen Isabeau." And for something a bit more recent, John Julius Norwich's posthumous History of France, which was published in 2018, states that Louis was highly intelligent and deeply versed in the arts and culture of Italy, but his debauches were notorious, and he was almost certainly the lover of the Queen. It may well be that some of her 12 children were his. I could go on, but it goes to show how enduring the depictions of Orleans and the Queen as frivolous, debauched, corrupt lovers are. And so, as we can see, the character assassination of Louis of Orleans and Queen Isabeau has those three elements as their core: the frivolity and immaturity, their corruption and misrule, and, of course, the affair. Now, the charges of immaturity really begin to be levied towards Orleans only once his brother succumbs to his mental illness. As the adult brother of the king, Orleans was a natural choice for the regency. But Philip the Bold was able to push for a regency council to take charge, rather than having Orleans be the sole regent, and a key part of Philip's success in establishing the council came from the perception that Louis was immature and frivolous. To be fair, he was a 20-year-old prince at the time, and so the charges of immaturity and frivolity are definitely not unbelievable, and they were certainly not made up of whole cloth. Louis did certainly enjoy a good party, but that didn't necessarily mean that he was unqualified for the regency, and these charges would continue to be levied well into the Duke's 30s. As for Queen Isabeau, many of the charges against her tend to come from radical friars, and here it seems that the sexism of late medieval churchmen is on full display. One often cited example comes from the harangues of an Augustinian friar named Jacques Legrand. While the friar did attack Isabeau for the conduct of her courtiers, and did blame her for a general degradation of morals at court, a closer look at Legrand's sermon reveals that his biggest issue with the queen and her courtiers was their fashion, which he deemed inappropriate. Now, the charges of corruption have a bit more merit, but this needs to be put into the context of the time where basically everyone was corrupt. So here the question should not be were Orleans and the Queen corrupt, but were they especially corrupt? Based on my own reckoning, I would say that for the Queen the answer would be no, and for Orleans it would be a qualified yes. One example of a complaint against the Queen's spending comes from a pamphlet called the Songe Veritable, which was written in 1406. A review of the Queen's household accounts by Richard Famiglietti shows that in the year prior, Isabeau received around 80,000 francs from the court, which is absolutely a lot of money, but really pales in comparison to Louis of Orleans' 400,000 francs in the same period. Now, Isabeau had to provide for the royal children the upkeep of courtiers, castles, and more. And again, the 80,000 francs which she spent definitely is a lot of money, but it was certainly within the normal amount for a queen to be allocated. For example, let's take as comparison the Duchess of Burgundy, Margaret of Mala, who, as a duchess, would be expected to have a fairly smaller household compared to the queen. She was allocated approximately 50,000 francs on a yearly basis. We also have to take into account the fact that Queen Isabeau of Bavaria was, well, from Bavaria. Xenophobia is absolutely not a new phenomenon, and was especially strong in the Middle Ages. Despite the fact that foreign queens were well within the norm, there was always some level of distrust. Therefore, when Isabeau tries to secure a court office for her brother, it's not seen as natural that the queen would want to have allies at court, but rather as a German scheme to infiltrate France and siphon away its resources. And moreover, Isabeau was a woman forced by circumstance to take on a leadership role in the kingdom. And remember, this is the Middle Ages we're talking about. It's impossible to ignore the fact that a lot of the criticism directed against her was based just on the perennial distrust of women in power. Now, Louis of Orleans, on the other hand, was being paid a frankly ridiculous sum of money. But he was also not alone in this. Philip the Bold was an arch-looter of the treasury and averaged about 230,000 francs annually in the years after 1396. And in his best year, he also managed to siphon around 400,000 francs. The other leading men of France, such as the Dukes of Berry, Bourbon, and Anjou, were receiving anywhere from 20 to 40,000 francs on a yearly basis, and that's only counting pensions. The total sum they received from the court, which would include things like salaries from royal offices they held, like special grants of tax revenues, and a few other things here and there, would be a good deal higher, and that is what I used for Philip the Bold's sum. But unfortunately, I don't have access to all of those numbers for the non-Burgundian dukes. So, within the context of the other looters of the treasury, Louis's 400,000 francs from 1405 does remain absurd, but maybe not unprecedented. We should also take note that around 1400, records show that Orleans' share from the treasury was a much more reasonable 100,000 francs, which again is still a lot, but not nearly as crazy, especially when you take into account what Philip the Bold is managing to siphon away. And it's really likely that he was only able to appropriate so much in 1405 due to the death of Philip the Bold the previous year, freeing up so much money. Now, along with the charges of corruption came charges of misrule. In 1405, John the Fearless, the son of Philip the Bold, was now trying to reclaim his father's place at the center of court, and so he levied a series of complaints against the rule of Orleans, which claimed that royal justice was failing throughout the kingdom, the government was being run for the good of Orleans and his partisans rather than for the common good, and that the resources of the king were being siphoned off by greedy nobles and advisors. John the Fearless did not pioneer these arguments, and his father had levied similar accusations against the Duke of Orleans. But John would refine them, and the perception of Louis of Orleans as corrupt cannot be divorced from John's own attempts to paint himself as a reformer and a crusader for good government. After the death of Philip the Bold, the Burgundian position at court basically collapsed. Philip the Bold was the son, brother, and uncle of 3 successive French kings. He had spent decades at the center of French politics, and he could reasonably claim his spot there as a birthright. John the Fearless, on the other hand, while still being closely related to the king, was at the end of the day just one cousin out of many. He was not a stranger to the court, but he had spent much time away from it, and while he did inherit his father's network of allies and clients, he did not have the same inherent connection to the court as a whole. Therefore, as a man on the outside, it was natural for him to pick up the demand for change and reform. In essence, the Duke of Burgundy became the opposition. This does not mean that John the Fearless's complaints can be dismissed, but rather that they should be taken with a grain of salt. Now, John the Fearless would not keep to simply complaining, and in 1407 he organized the assassination of the Duke of Orleans. And in the aftermath of the murder, John had the theologian Jean Petit prepare a justification for the deed. The justification of the assassination of the Duke of Orleans is a fascinating piece of medieval propaganda and serves as an urtext of the Burgundian attack against Orleans and his faction, which would evolve over the next few years. It was read out to the assembled notables of France in a speech which lasted for over 4 hours, and it was then printed and distributed throughout the kingdom. Historian Richard Vaughan calls it, quote, one of the most insolent pieces of political chicanery and theological casuistry in all of history. And Johann Huizinga calls it, quote, a real masterpiece of political wickedness, built up with perfect art and in a severe style. The libel of the justification was so damaging that Orleans' sons and supporters began to refer to it as the Duke's second murder. In the justification, the Duke of Orleans was accused of all sorts of things, using black magic to induce the king's madness, and plotting slowly to kill him using that same magic. And then, when the magic proved too slow, the Duke of Orleans was said to have plotted to poison the king with a poison apple a la the evil queen from Snow White. Furthermore, Petit claimed that the death of the Dauphin, the crown prince of France, was caused by one of those same apples. Petit also brought up the Bal des Ardents, or the Ball of the Burning Men, an event where the Duke of Orleans accidentally set a number of courtiers on fire, and he reframed this as a deliberate attempt to kill the king. Moreover, the Duke's good relationship with the papacy was also reframed as a way to secure papal approval for a coup against his brother. Petit declared that, quote, the late Duke of Orleans was devoured with covetousness of vain honors and worldly riches, and that, to obtain for himself and his family the most high and noble kingdom and crown of France by depriving our king of them, he studied all sorts of sorcery and witchcraft, and practiced various means of destroying the person of the king. From there, Petit went on to stress the connection between the Duke of Orleans' ambitions and the accusation of his disloyalty to the king and his tyranny when in charge of the royal council. The main through line of the justification was that the murder of the Duke of Orleans was not homicide, it was tyrannicide. The Duke was a tyrant, and it was actually right and good that he was killed. Orleans called for high taxes to be raised to fight the English, but instead of leading the army against the enemies of the kingdom, the Duke pocketed the revenue and let those enemies run roughshod throughout France. Orleans stuffed the administration with corrupt sycophants who abandoned the duties of their offices and instead enriched themselves. Orleans desired the throne and plotted to seize it from his brother. The Duke was a wolf in sheep's clothing. He was disloyal. He was a traitor. He was a tyrant. Over and over again, Jean Petit emphasized those three terms: tyrant, traitor, disloyal. In a way, the repetition of those terms was an attempt to create a new identity for the Duke of Orleans. If he was a false traitor, a wicked tyrant, a disloyal felon, then it was easy to forget that he was the only brother of the king, the first prince of the blood, the natural leader of France while Charles was indisposed. The king should thus not mourn the death of his brother, but celebrate the death of the criminal Duke of Orleans. Now, the justification is a clear piece of propaganda, more meant to, well, justify the Duke of Burgundy's actions than convince any neutral parties of Orleans' misdoings. And it is unlikely that anyone not already inclined to support Burgundy and oppose Orleans put much stock in it. However, that does not mean that the justification had no impact on Orleans' reputation, as his sons and supporters would go to great lengths to refute it and even tried to get it deemed heretical by the church. Now, We must note that one claim distinctly absent from the justification was the claim that Orleans had seduced Queen Isabeau. And in fact, that claim is totally absent from any contemporary source. For example, the Songe Veritable, which I mentioned earlier, is chock full of libel and vitriol directed against both the Queen and Orleans, but it is distinctly lacking in any claim of an affair between the two. And I will tell you that if any rumors of an affair were circulating at the time, no matter how wild they would be, they absolutely would have been included in the Songe Veritable. The first example of anything that even hints at an affair between Orleans and the Queen comes from Le Pastorelet, an allegorical poem rather than a chronicle or history, which was written probably around 1422 or 15 years after the death of the Duke of Orleans. Now, a pretty good amount of slanderous work directed against both the Queen and the Duke of Orleans does survive, so the fact that it took so long for rumors of an affair to surface seems to indicate that not only were those rumors false, but also that they were likely not on anyone's radar. The charges levied in the Pastorelet do indicate that a rumor probably began to circulate sometime around the 1420s, and this timeline is further backed up by the chronicles of Jean Chartier. Chartier, who was King Charles VII's official court chronicler, wrote that the English caused Queen Isabeau much pain through their assertion that Charles VII was not the son of Charles VI. Now, the first direct accusation of an affair between Louis and Isabeau can be found in the Chronicle of Metz, which was written in 1438, years after the deaths of both alleged participants. And we do see more mentions of an affair popping up in a chronicle from the 1470s, and then even more as we begin to enter the 16th century. So while the accusations of greed, frivolity, immaturity, and misrule do have some basis in reality, and a much further basis in the beliefs of contemporaries, the accusations of a sordid affair between the Duke and the Queen really have no basis in either. Now, it is likely that part of the reason that the claim that Louis and Isabeau were lovers is so enduring is that it simply makes for a good story. What's more interesting? The king's brother and wife leading the kingdom while he's indisposed and growing unpopular due to raising taxes to pay for a war and all of the other just regular issues of pre-modern governance? Or carrying on a salacious affair behind the king's back, bankrupting the kingdom through their greed, filling the royal administration with their stooges? Quite frankly, they're just easy figures to demonize by those who read the Burgundian propaganda uncritically or misread other sources which are critical of Louis and Orleans. Which are critical of Louis and Isabeau, but not necessarily opposed to their leadership. And now this demonization would get a second wind during the French Revolution. The Burgundian propaganda of Philip the Bold and John the Fearless fit neatly into the anti-monarchical worldview of many revolutionary historians. The Burgundian calls for reform were well received in a France where reform was so desperately needed, and the Burgundian attacks on the Duke of Orleans were also well received in a France where the royal family was growing increasingly unpopular. Historian François Autran writes of the historians influenced by the revolution, quote, "We understand their enthusiasm when they discovered the political writings of the early 15th century. They thought they were reading the lists of grievances and gazettes of 1789 and dreamed that they had been transported to Versailles at the opening of the Estates General. The waste and debauchery of the court, the disarray of the royal finances, the prevaricating ministers, the excessive pensions paid to the princes of the blood, and the character of the Austrian Marie Antoinette, played by Isabeau, the German." And I think that last point is especially salient. Marie Antoinette was an incredibly unpopular figure in revolutionary and post-revolutionary France, which meant that any comparison made to her would by default be unflattering. And even when the comparisons to Marie Antoinette began to fade, the Germanness of Queen Isabeau became more notable, as the Franco-German relationship deteriorated in the 1870s, and we all know how, things went with the World Wars. Now, the 20th and 21st centuries have seen a good amount of work dedicated to rehabilitating the reputations of both Louis of Orleans and Isabeau of Bavaria. But there are still many works out there that present both as greedy, debauched lovers. I found that most of these works tend to be either general histories of France or general histories of the medieval world that don't really have the time to dive into the details of how the kingdom was being run around the turn of the 15th century. Now, I hope that this presentation has done a bit to disperse some of the myths that have been built up around the two, and can serve as a reminder that none of us are immune to propaganda, not even medieval propaganda. Okay, that's the presentation.
All right. Awesome. All right. So we have about 15 minutes left of this session. So for
All
those who
right.
are listening, we have, if you have any questions, I do have one from Ethan Johnson, but if you do have
Mhm.
a question, feel free to put them in the chat. And I will also, if you raise your hand at the bottom of the screen, there's a raise hand option. I can also promote you to speak as well. So with that said, Ethan asks, do you believe that the reframing of history in this sort of way is purely a means to affect the politics of the present? And how focused are people in the centuries in the concept of their legacy? So I believe he's asking, are they doing this for the now or 200 years from now, people hearing back?
Sorry, so is this reframing of the Burgundian history or reframing of like our current history?
I believe it's Burgundian. I think
Okay,
what the spirit of the question is, are they
gotcha.
spreading these rumors to help themselves in the moment, or are they trying to help spread these rumors to help their legacy in the future or tarnish their legacy in the future?
Gotcha. I think that it's all very much directed in the moment. This is all happening as a civil war is beginning in France. The assassination of the Duke of Orleans basically unleashes about 30 years of absolutely brutal civil war between the Burgundians and the Orleanists, who eventually transition into a new faction, which is known as the Armagnacs, for reasons we don't have to get into right now. But this basically leads to France being laid low by decades of civil war. The English come in. There's the Battle of Agincourt. They take over like a third of the kingdom for a minute. There's an Anglo-Burgundian alliance that pops up from that. So it's all very focused on like trying to win the Civil War, get people to our cause. The assassination of the Duke of Orleans really is the core of what causes the Civil War. And the whole position of John the Fearless is I did nothing wrong. He's a fascinating figure, but it's very frustrating to read his histories sometimes because there are so many moments when there could be some sort of compromise if John the Fearless is basically willing to say, you know what, I get it, I fucked up, sorry, I screwed up. If he's willing to do that, if he's willing to, maybe like take a few years like away from court, realize that, go back to his lands, maybe send his son to represent his interests. But he's not willing to do that. No, he is desperate to cling to power. And so that also means that he's desperate to not recognize that he made any mistake in killing Orleans in the first place. And so the justification and all the propaganda really builds into that because if the murder of the Duke of Orleans is justified, then everything else that the Burgundians did are justified.
Awesome. Thank you. So Sydney, kind of with the question today, because I wanted to ask, she has two questions. The second one I wanted to ask, but
Oh yeah.
so Sydney asks, who seemed to have the most influence on Charles VII, and then also, how do you accidentally set several
Oh
courtiers
yeah.
on fire?
I'll admit I did kind of add that to my slides because I figured that would be a fun question to get into, even though it didn't quite fit with the presentation as a whole. I'll
It
get to that
worked.
in a second. In terms of Charles VII, the primary influence around him was the faction called the Angevins. Let me share my screen again real quick. Um, yeah, okay. So in the Valois family tree, the descendants of Louis of Anjou basically, Charles the Seventh gets married into their family. So his wife is, I believe, this Louis of Anjou's granddaughter. It may be great granddaughter. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Let's see. Jo-
But
Josh,
basically,
your screen isn't sharing if you're
oh,
trying
it's
to do
not.
something.
Oh,
Oh,
okay. Can
there
you
it
see
is.
now? Okay,
Yep.
yeah. So this Louis of Anjou, his granddaughter, I believe. And so he basically grows up with that family, and as he becomes king. So initially, Charles the Seventh wasn't actually gonna be king. He was like the fifth son, but then all his older brothers just died off. Um, and so he grows up with the family of Louis of Anjou rather than with the royal family. And so his mother-in-law, Yolande of Aragon, is an incredibly influential person in his life. And her brothers, Rene of Anjou and Charles of Anjou, become like some of the leading counselors in the kingdom. So they're very much who influences Charles the Seventh. As for who influences, Charles the Sixth, it really depends on whoever is in charge. Like I said earlier, the last person to talk to him is usually whoever he's going to agree with. So it really doesn't super matter how who is the most influential with him, so much as they're just able to get the last word in. And so basically it ends up being whoever is in charge of Paris at the time becomes his most influential advisor. Oh, and then now onto the Bal des Ardents. This is it's a pretty fun, well, maybe not fun for the people, but basically, in the Middle Ages, there was this tradition called, I think like the Bal des Sauvages, or the Dance of the Savages, where basically these nobles would it was a play on like a kind of turning over of social norms and stuff like that. So these nobles would basically dress in these like wild men costumes, and what those were essentially like they would like stick flax to their body. It was like canvas and flax, and I think the flax was attached to their clothes using like tar for the most part. So they were very flammable costumes. And so basically these men would just like don these costumes and like dance all over crazy, doing this and that. And it's a good fun time for a medieval person. But there was a strict rule of no one can bring any torches nearby because everybody knew that these costumes were incredibly flammable. And so for this particular ball, this Dance of the Savages, Louis of Orleans arrived late and he was very drunk. And so, he's like, I want to see what's going on. So he grabs a torch, he runs up to the front, and then, a spark, flies off of his torch and it lands on one of the dancers. And then from there, he basically erupts into flames, and then the fire spreads to all the other dancers. And so you can imagine this was a very traumatic and bad affair. The king himself was actually one of the dancers, but he was spared because the Duchess of Berry like threw her dress over him to protect him from the flame, and I think you can kind of see that over here. Um,
Oh, sure.
and then the another dancer survives because he threw himself into a vat of wine, which I don't think that's being illustrated here, but it might be. So there were two survivors, the king and the dancer who threw himself into the vat of wine. Everyone else died. It was a very not fun experience. And then Louis of Orleans, like his reputation like really suffered for a little while after that. And
Yeah,
so yeah,
I bet
uh,
it would.
yeah. But yeah, he had to, do a bunch of penance and whatnot, and so it was definitely a black mark on his reputation.
Well, I mean, that's not
Yeah.
awesome, but like that's a good little nugget. That's great.
Yeah.
Um, so one thing and this kind of goes back. So you mentioned I forget her name. I'm sorry, I should have written it down. But the queen that was from another place. I think it was the
Oh,
Burgundy Valois, right? Maybe.
the Duchess of Burgundy.
Yes.
Yeah.
How how ripe were they? Was someone coming from a different area, how easy of a target were they for those who wanted to just create rumors about them?
So you mean wait, Queen Isabeau or the
Yeah,
Duchess of
Queen
Burgundy?
Isabel. There we
Okay,
go.
gotcha,
There
gotcha.
you go.
Yeah. It does it's a fairly common occurrence where you see like a foreign queen like being distrusted. You know, this is a thing not just in French history, it's also in like English history. Basically, everywhere in the Middle Ages is you have a queen come in and she has like a core group of like ladies in waiting and like maybe a few like supporters and a few family members, and she wants to like make sure that they like have a role at court. But then whenever she tries to give them that role, people are like, oh, she's bringing foreigners in, she's gonna turn like England into France, or she's gonna turn France into Germany. um we can still see an element of that today, not to get into modern politics, but it goes to show that xenophobia is a very long-standing human affair. Um, so it wasn't specifically that, Isabeau was doing so much to like, siphon away France's resources. She wasn't like especially corrupt or anything, as I tried to show. But basically, um, it's all of these complaints that are really levied against basically every foreign queen that tries to do something. Um, and they were just amplified because, Isabeau had to take more power than the standard French queen would because, her husband thought he was made of glass and like couldn't rule at all. Um, so it really is a fairly common occurrence. And when you look into the history, you do see a lot of examples of foreign queens being demonized because they just have like a collection of foreign courtiers around them.
Awesome. We just got another question from Sydney. Did all of this instability, and keep in mind we have 2 minutes left, so Sydney, if
Okay.
this might be a bit of a longer explanation than 2 minutes, but did all of this instability stem from the reign of Charles VI, or did the reign of Charles V lay the groundwork for the decades of the Civil War?
So there is some historiography that does kind of like look into how things were set up in the reign of Charles V. But the general consensus is that the reign of Charles V was an extremely stable period for internal French affairs. We had a strong king that knew what he was doing. The princes of the blood were like leading armies. The army was like effective. Taxes were being raised, but they weren't like crushing or anything. It was a good time to be French. Um, and with Charles VI, you have a period of childhood regency because he is, I believe, 9 years old when he comes to the throne. And so there's a few years where his uncles are in charge. So Philip the Bold is one of these. So is, the Dukes of Berry, Bourbon, and Anjou. Um, sorry, Philip the Bold is one of these, as are the Dukes of Berry, Bourbon, and Anjou. And there is some tension going on there. For example, Charles V's plans for the regency were kind of shuffled around when the rubber hit the road.
Okay.
But when Charles VI like reaches his age of majority, so when he like takes power for himself, you see things kind of start to fall back into the way things were under Charles V. Charles VI is like reigning with good advisors. He's like a pretty deliberative king. He's a young guy at the time. He likes to party. He likes to have fun. So like there is, some charge of like immaturity and frivolity directed against him as well. But at the end of the day, the kingdom is being well run. It's really only once he, falls to his madness that things really kind of start to come off the rails. Because at the medieval world was very much focused around the king. The medieval political world, I should say, was very much focused around the king. And if you
Okay.
don't have a king that can kind of like make his own decisions, then, you're not really going to be able to get anything done. And so it was the power vacuum that the madness of Charles VI created, which really let things go off the rails. And I mean, we can see a similar thing happen a few decades later in England when King Henry VI kind of has a similar mental instability. And
Okay.
that kind of, that
Well,
sparks the Wars of the Roses.
all right. Well, awesome. I'll say that's about as concise as you can get in 2 minutes, I'm sure, for that
Yeah.
question. But I'm going to guess your show, Grand Dukes of the West, would go into that in a lot of detail. So,
Oh, it sure does. Yeah, I think I spend 20 something episodes on the Civil War.
oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, with that, that is our time for today. Thank you, Josh, for being with us here today. There are other sessions going on here in about 5 minutes. So, everyone, thank you for joining this session, and there's more to come for the day.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.